Okay, so here we have our first target on algebra. I will be able to solve algebraic equations by inspection and trial and error. Let's just start with a definition of what is algebra. And if you're behind on notes because you're absent, please write this in your notes as well. So algebra has many meanings and definitions, but the one we're going to use for our lessons in the beginning are using letters or symbols to represent a missing value that you are trying to find. Now here's something, you don't have to put this in your notes, I just thought this was interesting. So the word algebra comes from the Arabic, it's an Arabic word. And usually when it's translated into English, it's spelled like that at first, the A-L-J-A-B-R. And the literal meaning of it is the word restoration. And if you see the word restore in restoration, we're talking about the idea of fixing something or bringing something back together that was broken before. And there's this ancient job called an algebrista. And if you were an algebrista, you were a bone setter. So if somebody had broken a bone, you would go see an algebrista. And that, we can see, connects with the definition of restore, because you're trying to bring something back together to the way it was supposed to be. And we'll see that in math, the connection for algebra is trying to keep everything balanced, bring it back together through algebra the way things were meant to be. Okay, the balance part, I'm going to skip this slide for now. We'll come back to this on our second lesson. But if you want to make a note of it, it's fine, just to keep it in your head for future reference. Okay, so sometimes we hear the word algebra, we get all freaked out because it seems like a big fancy word. But honestly, if you look at this equation, this is all algebra is. Some number plus 3 equals 10. This is just one example. Now you've probably seen stuff like this maybe in 3rd grade. The difference now, instead of having a box there, or maybe sometimes you'll see a question mark, you're going to have what's called a variable, which is just a letter that's just going to stand in for a missing number that we are trying to find. So what number plus 3 equals 10? Well, that's going to be 7, so we would say the value of that variable of x is going to equal 7, because 7 plus 3 is 10. That's all that is. If you're able to do that, you can do algebra. So our target today is solving algebra through inspection. That means just kind of looking at it and trying to figure out with some mental math. So like we just said, 3 plus what number equals 10? That's the same as saying 3 plus x equals 10. And we would solve for x. X is going to equal 7. Here's some definitions we're going to need. So at some point, please write this down, pause the video if you have to put these 3 definitions into your notebook. I'm also going to take a moment to explain them. Expression. Expression is really another word for saying a math problem. So the example I gave there is 7 plus 3. That's a math problem. 7 plus 3. So sometimes you'll see your textbook say solve this expression. That just means solve this math problem. Now we have the next level, an equation. It's like a math problem, but with an equal sign. So it's similar to an expression, but an equation will always have an equal sign. So here, our example, 7 plus 3 equals 10. And if you want to think about a little trick to help you remember, equation has the word equal in it, so make sure that if you're trying to identify the difference between an expression and an equation is just a math problem with no equal sign, but as soon as you put an equal sign in there, then suddenly you have an equation. And our last definition for today is a variable. You might have heard this word in science, but a variable is just an unknown quantity, that means an amount or a number, represented by a letter or symbol. So here we have x plus 3 equals 10. This x, this letter, will be our variable. Okay, so here are a couple example problems. If you look at the top one with y divided by 3 equals 8. And also please put this in your notes if you don't have it there already. We'll put a little W in the corner, which means to the right. Excuse me. So you have y divided by 3 equals 8. Here's a little tip. I would really try to keep this in mind. Whenever you see a variable, you want to think what number, the phrase what number. So instead of reading this as y divided by 3 equals 8, think in your head what number divided by 3 equals 8. And if you do that mental math, you would get y equals 24, because 24 divided by 3 equals 8. Okay, a separate equation down below, x minus 9 equals 10. Same thing, as soon as we see our variable, we kind of replace it in our head with the phrase what number. So instead of saying x minus 9 equals 10, we think what number minus 9 equals 10. You could try to plug in a couple, okay, and kind of see if you get the right answer, but eventually you would find that the right answer is 19. Now, a couple lessons from now, we're going to learn a method to make sure we get the answer right every time. There's actually a step to solve these, but for now we're just going to solve by inspecting the problem, the equation. Here's a very important note. Here's an equation, an algebraic equation, 6d equals 18. If a variable is next to a number, we assume multiplication. Okay, so 6d equals 18 is the same exact thing as 6 times d equals 18, which we could also say 6 times what number would equal 18, okay? And as you think about it, you would realize the answer is 3, because 6 times 3 is 18. And just a note along the same lines, we will no longer be seeing an x for multiplication. So in other words, in algebra, you won't see things like 6 times 3. Written in this form anyway, because the x now is going to stand for a possible variable. So you might see 6x. This does not mean 6 times something anymore. This is just going to mean 6x with x being the variable. Okay, so that could be like 6 times x. Again, if we had it equals 18, we would have x as 3, because 6 times 3 is 18. So we will no longer use the x-looking symbol for multiplication. What you might also start to see, what you will start to see, is when you substitute a number in for the variable, so instead of 6x, we figured out a 3 equals 18, 6 times 3. If you put that 3 inside parentheses, that will also mean multiplication. So 6 times 3 equals 18. So that's another way to write multiplication now that we are not going to be using an x for its symbol. Okay, a couple more examples, and then we will move on to some indie work. Here we have h over 8 equals 24. We could say that in our heads as what number over 8 equals 24? And the extra little tip, remember this fraction bar means division. Okay, so we could also say what number divided by 8 equals 24. Okay. Actually, I think I wrote this one a little differently than I wanted to, because this is going to be a huge number. It'd actually be h equals 192. Okay, that's a little more advanced than I wanted to do. Let's look at the second one instead. My bad. 14 over x is like 14 divided by x equals 7. So 14 divided by what number equals 7? Well, if you think about it, it's going to be 2, because 14 divided by 2 equals 7. So we would say x equals 2. Okay. If you want to think about it backwards, since multiplication is the opposite of division, we go backwards and do multiplication. So we can think 7 times what number would get us 14. We're still going to get 2, because that's the answer, but it could be a little trick to do multiplication backwards, going backwards from right to left instead of division. Okay, I think we're ready for our indie work. If you didn't do this already, maybe you're absent. There's the work there. You can pause. Make sure you please write the questions and the answers.